In 1993, in June, Paul Denyer murdered his first victim that we know of, Elizabeth Stevens, and Elizabeth was getting off the bus in Langwarrin. He had picked a rainy night to target her, and he put a fake gun in her side, sort of grabbed her and said, "I've got a gun. If you don't come with me quietly, I'm going to shoot you." In the meantime, there was such a huge fear in the community that the police sent in 200 extra cops. And there were so many that on the day that Natalie died, Paul Denyer's car was checked twice that day. He said, "I've wanted to kill since I was 14. This was indicative of his mindset that everything that he did was very, very focused on, I'll make a weapon for killing, I'll plan killing, I will stalk women. Everything that I do in my day is all about the stalking of women to kill."
Did he ever explain why he picked them?
He said they were... So in 1993, in June, Paul Denyer murdered his first victim that we know of, Elizabeth Stevens, and Elizabeth was getting off the bus in Langwarrin, and he had picked a rainy night to target her, and he put a fake gun in her side, sort of grabbed her and said, "I've got a gun. If you don't come with me quietly, I'm going to shoot you." And Elizabeth was 18, and she went with him, and he took her around to Lloyd Park in Langwarrin, and he killed her, and he carved a strange crisscross pattern in her torso. And so the murder was really brutal, and her body was found the next day, and the police were at a complete loss to know who would target her. So Elizabeth had only been in Melbourne for a couple of months, and she had moved from Tasmania, so she hadn't really developed a friendship group. She didn't have a boyfriend. She didn't really know anyone. She had started studying at the local TAFE in Frankston, and that's why she was catching the bus home from the library. And they had no idea how she came to be dead in Lloyd Park or who could have done it. And then a couple of weeks later in early July, the second victim, Dhedhy Fream, who just had a baby, I think little Jake was about 12 days old, and she goes up to the milk bar to get milk and leaves the baby at home with a friend who'd come around for dinner to look at the baby. And the milk bar's in the street that she lives in, so I'll just duck up to the shops and get some milk, and she doesn't come home. And it turned out that Denyer had climbed into the back seat of her car when she went into the milk bar, and when she got out, he again had used the fake gun. It was like this wooden block that he'd fashioned into a gun shape, and said, "Drive or I'll shoot you." And he directed her to Taylor's Road right at the back of kind of Carrum Downs, and he killed her. So the police had these two female victims of a similar age, both with stab wounds, with throat injuries that killed them, and some of them thought that it was a serial killer and some didn't, and they were investigated separately anyway just in case they weren't connected. But because Frankston had had a spate of murders in the 80s, that the newspapers jumped on it, and it's corridor of death and, people living in fear, and the newspapers, really the headlines were serial killer. And I interviewed a man called Claude Minesini who'd trained with John Douglas at the FBI Academy at Quantico, the behavioural science unit, and he'd done the profiling course, and he had no doubt. He said, you've got women who were snatched at random, you have things like strangulation was used as a form of control but not to kill, and so there was some kind of rope or tie to go around the neck, but it was to maybe subdue them, and then the other injuries killed them. So he saw patterns that were really, really interesting, and came up with a map of where the offender might live, and which turned out to be really accurate. But of course it doesn't help in the finding of him, but it helps in understanding these kind of offenders. And so in the meantime, there was such a huge fear in the community that the police sent in 200 extra cops. They were door knocking, cops were everywhere. And there was so many that on the day that Natalie died, which was at the end of July, this all happened in a 7-week period. Paul Denya's car was checked twice that day. So once at the Flora and Fauna Reserve and then once on Sky Road, right opposite the bike track where she walked down on her way home from school. And there was something about him and also something about the fear in the community that a postal worker was riding her little motorbike along the footpath and she noticed him crouching down in the car, and there was something about him that she's gone, that guy looks really creepy. So she had gone and knocked on the door of a house a bit further down and said, can I use your phone to ring the police? And so by the time the police got there, he was gone, the car was still there, and he was killing Natalie down the bike track when the police were checking his car. And so when her body was found, she was just walking home from school at 2:30 in the afternoon. And when her body was found on the bike track, the 2 cops that checked the car went to the bosses and went, we were just checking a car of a suspicious guy in the afternoon. And so here's the details of the car. And so the police were knocking on his door that day, the day after he killed Natalie. And they took him into custody or took him to the police station, and he hasn't had a minute's freedom since.
Yeah.
So that's how they caught him.
From your research, I'm assuming you researched Paul Denya quite a bit as well. Did he have like a reason to do it? Like what was his issue? Was it just he just wanted to kill someone random? Did they like how did that go about according to your researching?
He talked about, in his interview, he said, I've wanted to kill since I was 14.
Right.
And the development of serial killers in some of the research that I've read, it does start sort of at puberty, that instead of developing into a normal, what is normal? I don't know what normal is, but you know what I mean. A regular person, he's developing the desire to kill, and that's taking over all of his thoughts. He talked about the fact that he killed because his brother had sexually abused him. The police didn't really ask him in detail about that, but they did say, well, why women? And he goes, just hate them. And so how he got to be the killer of women after being sexually abused by his brother, that's his allegation, I don't know. But it triggered something in him that made him a killer. But he was very dedicated to killing. And I think that is a feature of a serial killer too, that all of their mindset is around killing. And there's one bit in his interview where he's walking police through his house and he points to a broken tracksuit. You know, the tracksuits have the tie around the middle? Yeah. And he said, oh, that broke off from my tracksuit, so I kept it for strangling. And then he kept walking, and I thought, this is the difference. This is what he's showing us he is, that if our tracksuit tie broke, we might say, oh, I'll keep that to tie the tomatoes or I'll keep it for whatever. We wouldn't go, oh, I'll just keep that for killing. And so this was indicative of his mindset, that everything that he did was very, very focused on, oh, I'll make a weapon for killing, I'll plan killing, I will stalk women, everything that I do in my day is all about the stalking of women to kill.
Did he ever explain why he picked them?
He said they were random.
Okay.
I wonder about that because a couple of weeks before she was murdered, Elizabeth Stevens had come flying in from the bus stop and said to her uncle, someone was following me, and he's gone outside. He was a tough guy. Like he wasn't one to shirk from maybe, go out on the street and I'll find them. And so she felt that she had been followed. Now, when I talked to Denya's family, and I spent a lot of time with his sister-in-law and his brother, and it turned out that the house that Elizabeth Stevens lived in was a house that Paul had been to a lot, and his brother's girlfriend used to live in that exact house. Mm-hmm. Now, is it a coincidence that Elizabeth was followed, and is it a coincidence that she was then murdered? It's a big bloody coincidence, isn't it? The same house, right? Melissa Denya, his sister-in-law, had just had a baby, and then he targets Debbie Fream, who's just had a baby. And the same night that he'd targeted Debbie, he'd tried to snatch a woman in Seaford, so again, catching the train down, and he had tried to grab her, and she bore a strong resemblance in age and appearance to his mother. And so, and then Natalie Russell was a schoolgirl called Natalie. His sister was a schoolgirl called Natalie. Is there a coincidence? I don't know. It could have been completely random, but serial killers will often target representations of women who they feel have wronged them or symbolically killing people in their lives. And the women that he targeted seemed to be very much representative of women in his life. So is it random? He said it was. The police didn't care whether it was or it wasn't because it's their job to catch him, get a confession and a conviction and put him away. So they're not psychologists wanting to write his life story or wanting to find out. It's their job to get him off the streets. So the writer has a very different function to police and the courts. And I don't know, I just noticed these patterns and thought, oh, could they be not coincidences?